Hey Blitzers, I have another sub request from SCP-049J on multi-turreted and cannon tanks in Blitz. He had mentioned things about the KV-6, which I understand was not a real tank, but quite interesting. There were actually quite a bit of different multi-turreted and cannon tanks designed in the earlier years, World War I, World War II, some of them pretty crazy. I actually recently did a video on the SMK, but these are just some examples of the ones that I had found online that had multi-turreted cannon and tanks. And they're actually quite interesting. I think there could be a way for Blitz to use these, but one of the things he was also mentioning, just with the sub request, is with the Chi-Ri, which I'll go into talk about a little bit more. But there were things like the KV-6, the P-1000 Rat, and even a lot of others that you're seeing right here, the Char FCM and so forth. So really, when it comes down to multi-turreted tanks in history, there was the idea or the concept of them was to be able to shoot more and faster when using two cannons and two turrets, to be able to destroy enemies faster or multiple enemies faster. Now, the downfall with the multi-turreted cannon system is the weight. It would be a lot more weight to add an additional turret and cannon instead of just having the one cannon on the tank. And it's almost like having two tanks in one place. And if you get that tank knocked out, both of those cannons are also knocked out. Whereas if you had two different tanks, you can keep those separated and avoid from both of them getting destroyed. But really what it comes down to, that's not really the core issue. The core issue was the weight. Whereas the engine power and the engines that were capable of pushing these vehicles along was only so much. And you either had to have less armor because of the additional weight from the turret and cannon, which then would make you more prone to getting penned from the enemy, getting destroyed, or just having the one turret. So the weight factor is really what pulled these things down, I guess, so to say. So the KV-6 in general is quite interesting because, to answer the one question about that, this thing was a monstrous beast at like over 50 feet, just absolutely crazy. Armor anywhere from about 0 to 60 millimeters, and only 13 miles per hour. I mean, the T-95 goes, I think, about 16, so it's even slower than that. This thing would be extremely slow. And it has the 2 kV type cannons. I do have an idea for how Blitz could potentially make this work. Really, in order to make a multi-turreted and cannon system work in Blitz, you would need to have all cannons equal the same fair DPM of whichever tier that tank was put at. So for example, if I had to put the KV-6 as a tier, just depending on like what it is, the type of cannons it has, the armor, it would probably be around a 6 or 7. It doesn't have the maneuverability, it doesn't have the armor, it doesn't have the cannons to compete with something at tier 9 or 10. You've got the KV, two of those, the 150 millimeters. You got the 85 millimeters / 75 millimeter cannons from the KV-1, and then the BT-7 cannon on top with the 45 millimeter. Now, with all those cannons, the reload rate and the DPM would have to equal the same fair amount of whatever tier that was put in. 160 millimeters at how flat the KV-6 was is not going to last very long, especially you'll learn if you dive into history. The Germans kind of learned this the hard way. Size was not an important factor when it came to tanks in the game. or sorry, in the war, and which had led to actually being more of a downfall than an advantage. It's 13 kilometers an hour, pretty slow, or 13 miles per hour, I mean. So you would have to have that DPM pretty much the same. Now, with tanks such as the Chi-Ri, the thing about that is with the additional cannon that it has on the front of it, it only has, I think, like a tier 2 or tier 3 cannon. I think it was like a 30 to 40 millimeter cannon. The Chi-Ri at a tier 7 tank, that millimeter of cannon is not going to do any good. It won't really do anything, even if you could use something like that in Blitz. However, there are other tanks that have cannons that could potentially be used. There is one, like the B1 French Heavy Tier 4. That one has a 75 millimeter Hauser on the front of it, whereas the primary weapon being used in Blitz on the thing is actually the smaller millimeter gun. And so I would think it'd be quite interesting to make both of those work. It could add a little bit more of that realistic factor. But it all comes down to, I think if Blitz were to incorporate this, you could have multiple firing buttons for which one, which may be a little confusing, especially when you have something like a KV6 where there's so many buttons. But each turret would turn toward the location. Each one would have its own reload speed. But because of that, the DPM having to be equal, it would have to be, the reload rate would have to be divided across all the cannons that were on the tank. So, and if you had like if a 460 Alpha cannon had a reload rate of like 4 or 5 rounds a minute, on a tank that had one cannon, on a tank that has multiple cannons, that actually may be would have to be cut in half. Like maybe only 2.5 or like 2 rounds a minute. And then the other DPM spread across the other cannons. So that's just my thoughts on it. If Blitz were to put multi-cannon and turreted tanks in the game, there's a lot. I mean, as you saw just from some of the examples at the beginning, there are some that you could do from that. But anyway, will they bring them out in the game? Like I said in my SMK video, they had just come out actually with double barrel cannons and tanks in the game. So who knows? I mean, I see it could potentially be possible. I could see how a lot of people would say these are overpowered, but I think if you kept the DPM the same. But I also see with a lot of these multi-turreted tanks, just like I was saying, there's a lot of turrets or additional cannons or guns that were on these things where if you were fighting against similar tiers that you were up against, those cannons would actually be too weak and they wouldn't do really anything. A tier 2 cannon is not going to do anything against like a tier 6 or 7 battle. So I think the only cannons, if Wargaming were to do something like this, and I think it would actually add some unique gameplay, which would be cool, would be the cannons that actually could do something. So anyway, hope this helps. Hope you guys enjoyed the vid. This is the Muffin here. You guys stay cool and keep tanking.